Welcome to Globus Books Virtual Living Room Literary Salon. Today we are super excited, and we're always excited to bring the guests, but today is very special because we have Valzhyna Mort, who will read us her wonderful, amazing poems in English and in Belarusian. And we will have a chance to ask her questions. Valzhyna Mort is a poet and translator born in Minsk, Belarus. She's the author of 3 poetry collections: Factory of Tears, Copper Canyon Press 2008, Collected Body that we have right here, Copper Canyon Press 2011, and most recently a hardcover, Music for Dead and Resurrected, FSG 2020, which was named one of the best poetry books of 2020 by the New York Times and NPR. Mort is the recipient of fellowships from the Lannan Foundation, the Amy Clampett Residency, and the Civitella Rainery Residency. Her work has been honored with the Bess Hawking Prize from Poetry, the Glenna Lucia Prairie Schooner Award, and was shortlisted for the Forward Prize. Her work has appeared in Best American Poetry, New Yorker, Poetry, Poetry Review, Poetry International, Prairie Schooner, Granta, Gulf Coast, White Reviews, and many more. With Ilya Kaminsky and Katy Ferris, Mort co-edited Gossip and Metaphysics, Russian Modernists' Poems and Prose. Mort teaches at Cornell University and writes in English and Belarusian. She translates between English, Belarusian, Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish. She has received the Gulf Coast Prize in Translation and the National Endowment for the Arts Grant in Translation for her work on Polina Barskova's book on selected poems, Air Raid, from Ugly Duckling Press 2021. And Polina will actually briefly appear here in the show. Valzhyna Mort's poetry collections have come out in translation in Germany, Sweden, and Ukraine, while single poems have been translated into a dozen of languages. She has received the Burda Prize for Eastern European Authors, Germany, and the Crystal of Valencia Prize, Slovenia. Her Belarusian books are Я тоненькая, як твои веки, I hope I pronounce it right, Lochvinau 2005, and Epidemia Rujai, please correct me if it's wrong, Lochvinau 2017. I'm just gonna say a couple of words about Globus Books if you're not familiar with us. It's a small magical bookstore, completely independent in San Francisco, a historical part of it. It's beautiful. We carry tons of books in Russian, English, some other languages about the former Soviet Union space, and that includes many countries and diaspora. And we also run this YouTube channel where we have a pleasure of hosting some cutting-edge poets, critics, artists, and just very interesting people from all over the globe. I'm very happy to pass the microphone to Valzhyna Mort.
Hello, everybody. Vitayu. Thank you so much, Zarina, for the introduction, and thank you for Globus Books for hosting me. Do support, if you can, magical, small, independent bookstores. They are the greatest little places in the world. I will start by reading one poem in 2 languages. I plan to read just in English today, but I hear that there are some Belarusian speakers and learners in the audience. So I'll start by reading a poem in 2 languages, which is something I used to do when my first book came out. And I'll read a poem called Pripinki Ars Poetica, Bus Stops Ars Poetica, which takes us straight to the streets of Minsk. Не книги, а вулица открыла мне рот, як лыжка лекара. Одна за одной вулицы представились именами забойцов. У державных архівах вокладкі прыраслі тромбамі да ўліковых кніг акрываўленых. У маленькай кватэры я збудавала сябе асобны пакой. У маленькай кватэры я збудавала сябе асобны пакой, засяліла яго калібанамі планаў на будучыню. Будучыня, што ходзіць па раскладзе грамадскага транспарту, ад зоапарка да цырка будучыня. Ці маеш алібі на архівы, на вуліцы, на кватэры будучыня? У сумцы, якая трымала праз 3 вайны пасведчанні аб нараджэнні мерцвякоў. Бабуля хавала ад мяне шакалад. Сумка адкрывалася, як рот, што крычыць. Сумка адкрывалася, як рот, што крычыць. 2 спражкі назіралі за мной праз сцены, праз дні, праз джаз. Хто навучыў цябе, сумка, быць страшным тварам? Цалую спражкі, клянуся быць тваёй служкай. Жнівень, яблыкі. У мяне нікога няма. Яблык паспеў, вось мне і сям'я, і 4-ногі стол замест кота. У храме гастраному я стаўлю сябе як свечку, у чаргу да жрыцы, што ахоўвае веды цэн на мяса, цнатлівасць пакетаў малака. Моя будучыня крыху рэшты. Будучыня, што ходзіць па раскладзе грамадскага транспарту. Вуліцы прадставіліся імёнамі забойцаў, а я збудавала з сябе асобны пакой, у якім памяць нелегальная эмігрантка праз час бясконца прыбірае за ўяўленнем. У пакоі, дзе памяць здымае бялізну з ложкаў, бялізну, што тромбамі прырасла да матрацаў. Я цалую яблычкі, мае брацікі, цалую спражкі, што назіраюць за намі праз сцены, праз дні, праз джаз. Шакалад з сумкі, якая трымала праз 3 вайны пасведчанні аб нараджэнні мерцвякоў. Трымай мяне, яблычак. Not books, but a street opened my mouth like a doctor's spatula. One by one, streets introduced themselves with the names of national murderers. In the state archives, covers hardened like scabs over the ledgers. Inside a tiny apartment, I built myself into a separate room. Inside a tiny apartment, I built myself into a separate room, peopled it with the Calibans of plans for the future. Future that runs on the schedule of public buses, from the zoo to the circus. What future? What is your alibi for these ledgers, these streets, this apartment? Future. In the purse that held through 7 wars the birth certificates of the dead, my grandmother hid from me chocolates. The purse opened like a screaming mouth. The purse opened like a screaming mouth. Its 2 shiny buckles watched me through doors, through walls, through jazz. Who has taught you to be a frightening face, purse? I kiss your buckles, I swear myself your subject. August, apples, I have no body. August, for me a ripe apple is a brother. For me a 4-legged table is a pet. In the temple of supermarket I stand like a candle in the line to the priestesses who preserve the knowledge of sausage prices, the virginity of milk cartons, my future small change. Future that runs on the schedule of public buses. Streets introduce themselves with the names of national murderers. I build myself into a separate room where memory, the illegal migrant in time, cleans up after imagination. Bus stops, my future, an empty seat. In a room where memory strips the beds, linens that hardened like scabs on the mattresses. I kiss little apples, my brothers. I kiss the buckles that watch us through walls, through years, through jazz. Chocolates from a purse that held through 7 wars the birth certificates of the dead. Hold me Brother Apple.
Thank you, Valzhyna. This is one of many moving poems in the book. I love reading them by myself in the silence, and I love hearing you read it in both languages. And that brings me to my first question, which is about one of the prevailing themes in your poetry, the way I see it. It's the silence versus sound versus the absence of sound. And another theme is liminality, as in between languages, countries, eras, being alive and dead. So I will start with a question about the sound silence in your poems. In Collected Body, you talk about death that decides to hear, death that mouths, and you also write about death of genocide victims falling into a kind of archive of silence. And you, a bard of unsayable, speak of trying to untie the nerves of silence. It's silence, silence, silence. And one of the major silences that you address in your work is the silence of history and the silence of the dead, the silence of the grave. You write a lot about history of Belarus, and you said in an interview once that, and you write about it in your poems, that the grandmother told you the stories about the Stalinist repressions and the World War II and living in Soviet Belarus after World War II, and that you were angry and sad in history classes and literature classes because the stories of your family, of your dad, had no place in the official historical narratives. You're writing about the history of World War II in Belarus, where every third or fourth person was killed during the German occupation in 1941 to 1944, are heartbreaking, astonishing, groundbreaking. You, for instance, write about a nonverbal man of Khatin, 5 kilometers, and 1968 collaboration between filmmaker Igor Kolovsky and writer Alesa Domovich. And Khatin, not to be mixed up with Katyn, is a fire village. It's the site of a massacre where over 600 villages like that were burned by the Nazis. People were burned alive. So it was a genocide, and it's not well known. One might say it's forgotten, or in other words, silenced. So like Svetlana Alexievich or Polina Barskova, you take upon the role of the voice of a survivor, or as in your words, the keeper of the dead, and claim back the space for them, not just the sound. So you make them visible versus unsayable. We did have a talk with Polina Barskova here at Globus about her doing this work with the poetry, unofficial poetry of the blockade Leningrad, the siege poetry. And we were talking about the transgenerational transmission of trauma and how the unspoken secrets and lies and pain of the dead and past permeate and form the living and the present, us. So can you talk about your connection to history? How does your family history tie into your writing? Is your piece about Aunt Anna in the Collected Body based on your family history?
I do not like to think of myself as somebody who writes about my family. So I'm starting at the end of your question. I like to think of myself as a writer who runs away from my family, running away from growing up in a small apartment in the Południowy Zachód neighborhood of Minsk, from the stinky elevator that I had to take to the apartment, from the overcrowded buses that I took every morning and afternoon, going to and from school, from housework and garden work in the summer in the village, from hating school. I would like to run from all of that. I think that it's a bit like in a dream where we would love to move and we think that we're moving, but we are in fact standing in one place. So it's a little bit like that dream running, in which I would like to run, but I stay in the same place, and I have not really moved. I come from a very small family. I grew up without relatives, and that's how you know in Belarus that you come from a family of a survivor. That's how you know that your one grandparent is a survivor. And I always thought that it was very claustrophobic to belong to this very, very small world of just so few people that you could count on one hand who were your people. But then my grandmother's stories were full of brothers, full of siblings, full of cousins, full of aunts and uncles, full of deaths of various people. And it was also very claustrophobic inside these stories, inside these dead people packed into fragmented short sentences in her stories. And so I turn to this dead a lot, to Aunt Anna, to Aunt Bronya, who appears in this book, to Václav, who is not Václav Havel, but my grandmother's brother, to Boleslav, her brother that got lost, who was 4 years old when Minsk was bombed, and they were in an orphanage, and he was lost, and she spent her whole life looking for him. Her whole post-life, she was looking for the child that disappeared in a bombing. And I found myself looking for him too, everywhere. And I write about these people, not so much because they're my family, and I want to tell the story of my family, but because I have a very clear understanding that I'm the only person who can claim these people. Plus, of course, I grew up listening to their stories every day. I would come from school, sit down to have lunch in the kitchen before rushing out to go to my music school. And my grandmother would sit across from me at the table and talk about hunger. She loved to talk about hunger while we were eating, and talk about loss, talk about the way different people in her family died, talking about, of course, how beautiful everybody was. So that there was always beauty and death, always next to each other. Mother was beautiful and dead. Father could sing beautifully, and then he was dead. I imagined them. They were part of my imagination since childhood. So it only makes sense that when I write, and I travel somewhere in my imagination, their space where these people are is like a purgatory, right? I have to go through it every time because my way of imagining things is shaped by hearing those stories every day, but also by their absence, of course. And that's why in the poem I read, it is a purse that is screaming. Not me, not my grandmother, not somebody else. And I always felt that heaviness and the burden, not of mine, but of things, of inanimate objects, because inanimate objects are the only real survivors. Inanimate objects are eternal. And also in Eastern Europe, in Belarus, we pickle everything. So it all stays in a jar in this Kunstkamera, right? It's all pickled. All of these cucumbers and tomatoes that witness us and outlive us. And I remember those lines in Czeslaw Milosz that are very dear to me. What is eternal? Pickles with dill in a jar, that's what's eternal. And so I have that always since childhood. In part of my imagination was that inanimate objects around me, patterns too on the wallpaper, on the curtains, were imbued with witnessing and imbued with testimony, and everything screamed. Everything around screamed in these voices of things, not humans, and that there was no human language to talk about the inhuman experience, about the legacy of violence that does not end. But also, let me just say before I finish answering this very long question, that having said all of this, I'm not a person particularly interested in stories. As a poet, I'm more interested in tensions between things. And so what's amazes me, because I come to this not so much from pain and trauma, even though the word trauma, of course, is very handy, but it's not a word from my personal vocabulary. For me, it's a very academic word. I rather come to this from this position of amazement. I'm just amazed. I'm in awe how such drastic oppositions could coexist in a human life. So how somebody could be beautiful and have a husband who sings beautifully, and they could have all these many children, and then everybody would die within a year or so. Or how one could belong to a plot of earth and be born in a kitchen of a house where every day you eat, right? You wake up there and you go and you eat and you return there for work, yet you cannot die on this plot of earth. You're elsewhere. So the absent graves are there. Or this strange way in which people travel. So people would say, I know only my village. I've never been anywhere. And then you would talk more to them. And it turns out that they also know some God-forgotten town or village somewhere in the north of Russia. So, right, that they were displaced and then returned. But they would say, I've never been anywhere else. But it's such a strange way of personal geography, to be in some God-forgotten village in Belarus and in some God-forgotten village somewhere in the north of Russia and nowhere else, and to have access to nothing else. So these oppositions is what amazes me. And this is what I think this is what I move to, this is what I address when I write, not so much just the stories.
I want to bring the next question, which is kind of like continuing what you just talked about, another silence, huge silence, which also is a forming experience. Well, we want to avoid the word trauma, but whatever you call it, catastrophe, which is Chernobyl, which formed several countries at one time in one day, you might say. And the aspect that I want to bring in and ask you about is the silence around Chernobyl, because we know that trying to conceal what happened, the Soviet officials did not share the information, and the parades, the 1st May parade and the 9th May parade continued in Minsk and in Kiev and in Kharkov, in all the major cities in Belarus and Ukraine. And people were affected for years. In fact, I'm still speaking to people who are affected now. There are consequences. So I know you've been writing about it. You have poems about it. Can you speak to us a bit about that and maybe read some poems?
I was 4 or 5 when Chernobyl disaster happened, so I do not remember myself without it, outside of its context. But the way that it existed in my life, and I think that in other lives around me, is very much the way radiation exists in the soil, in the landscape, kind of silently. A year before Chernobyl explosion, my parents bought a house in the village, planning to grow and cultivate our own food and to be self-reliant. What I never learned from them, and only calculated later by myself, was that the house, that the village where the house was bought was the house where my great-grandmother died. And in fact, that house was on the street in the village. I walked by it all the time and knew people who lived in it then. That rundown house where we lived overlooked a hill, and that was a hill where my grandmother was born and where their house stood. And that's the place where her whole family was dislocated from. And so every summer, every day, we looked at that hill without ever discussing what we were looking at. And to me, all of these silences are very radioactive. And so Chernobyl, in many ways, immediately became a metaphor, and history became a metaphor for Chernobyl. You know, because I was little, it was a time of fairy tales too. It was a time of monsters. But what Chernobyl brought, because there was no discussion really, there was no public conversation about Chernobyl, there was just fears and gossip about monster children, about monster animals. And that kind of a fairy tale, the Brothers Grimm, right? It just entered our lives very organically like that. And in fact, many years later, I was somewhere in Western Europe, and there was an exhibit of portraits of the children of Chernobyl in town. And the portraits were on billboards all around town. And when I was told that, I was completely horrified. I did not want to look. I was afraid to look up at these portraits, because for me, I expected to see monsters. And then, of course, I saw children who looked just like me and my friends, and I could not put the two together. I could not understand why people looked at it with such empathetic sadness, because it was just like us. There was nothing sad about us, you know. Of course, there was silence, and then there was Chernobyl Way, the big rally that happens annually in Belarus. On the one hand, it's a very important rally. On the other hand, I can name the names of politicians and political activists who participated and initiated this rally, but I cannot name the names of people who died on the first day of the Chernobyl disaster, for instance. I do not know the names of the liquidators. I wonder about people my age, because I feel like we share, right? We share our lives. We live on the same time, on the same timeline. I wonder about them and how they were dislocated, how they were refugees from the Chernobyl zones. And I know that I never read any memoirs of these people. Svetlana Alexievich, in the 5 years after the disaster, interviewed over 500 witnesses, and Voices of Chernobyl came out 10 years after the Chernobyl disaster, and is a very important book that is still very much not processed, I think, by our society at large. For many reasons, one of which is still incredibly painful to read these accounts. And the reason why it is terribly painful is that that kind of testimony, individual testimony, is lacking. And I'm thinking here mostly of prose. With poetry, of course, is a completely, I think, disastrous situation, because something like Chernobyl requires a completely different form of language, of poetic language. And we do not have that language. And I think that the whole international poetry world is looking for that language. And by that, I mean eco-poetry, ecological poetry, poetry that figures out a way and a language to talk about the climate crisis and to talk about ecological crisis in the world. And Chernobyl is a part of that history and that crisis. And the only book that is helpful to me in that, poetry response that is helpful to me in that, is Ingeborg Christensen's book, Alphabet. But that's already a book that is a few decades old, and it has found a new language to talk about this kind of disasters. But in Belarus, we still do not have a poetic response to it, which is to say, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We have a lot of really bad poetic response to it, in which we, replace the words Soviet Union and motherland with Chernobyl and something else, and write in the same language with the same intonation. I think that it takes time to find a poetic language. For me, a great example is always Anna Swierczynska, a Polish poet who took 30 years before she published her book Budowałam barykady, Building the Barricades, talking about her experience in Warsaw during World War II. So in order to write in a language that is completely free of public discourse, that is comes out of individual poetic creative response, and language that has eliminated anything that is not poet's own language, that is not a word created anew. How about I read a poem called Nocturne on a Moving Train? It is a train that is moving across Belarus. Usually moves to the western border, to Brest, where it will have to be lifted on the border and hang there for an hour while you're shaken. So that wheels can be changed and history can be changed. The relationship to human life and human rights can be changed, and you can be remodeled into somebody who can enter the West. And here the poet is looking out from the window, but it's dark and the light is on in the compartment, so you do not see what's out there. You see only yourself. The trees I've glimpsed from the window of a night train were the saddest trees. They seemed about to speak, then vanished like soldiers. The hostesses handed out starched linens for sleep. Passengers bent over small icons of sandwiches. In a tall glass, a spoon mixed sugar into coffee, banging its silver face against the facets. The window reflected back a figure struggling with white sheets. The posts with names of towns promised a possibility of words for what flew by. In lit-up windows, people seemed to move as if performing surgery on tables. chestnut parks side the size of creatures capable of speech. Radiation, an etymology of soil directed into the future, prepared a thesis on the new origins of old roots, on secret, disfiguring missions of misspellings, on the shocking betrayal of apples, on the uncompromised loyalty of cesium. My childish voice, my hands, my feet, all my things that live on the edges of me. Shh, now. The chestnut parks, I about to speak, but now they vanished. I was extracted from my apartment block, chained to the earth with iron playgrounds, where iron swings rose like oil wells. I was extracted before I could dig a language out of air with my childish feet. I was extracted by beaks, storks, cranes. See the conductor punching out eyes of sleeping passengers. What is it about my face that turns it into a document, into a ticket stretched out by a neck? Why does unfolding this starched bedding feel like skinning someone invisible? Why can't the spoons head down in glasses stop screaming? Shh. The chestnuts are about to speak.
Always requires a pause and a silence to take it in, but we also need to continue. Right.
I see a question about bilingual poems from Angela, who is herself a bilingual poet.
Well, I actually write mainly in Belarusian, but it's true that my mother tongue is Spanish. So that's why I always pay attention to language in this special way. And that's why I'm interested in how Valzhyna creates in Belarusian and in English and maybe other languages. I don't know. So mainly that's the nature of my question. It's more of an open question. I'm given some prompts, like how are poems that exist in two languages created, if there's an original version usually, or if they are parallel poems, or some lines are written in one language and some in the other, depending on the particularities of the languages, how the process feels in Belarusian, in English, maybe the translation progress, the interlingual process, sorry, and yeah, about other languages. Maybe Valzhyna has written in other languages that she knows or has studied. So that's pretty much. Yeah, so how about language? Let's talk about language. And thank you very much for your poems. Those were amazing.
I just want to add really quickly that with some things, I mean, and I felt this in October, and maybe I didn't tell you that, but with some things with the soundscape, and particularly, I always keep writing down every time I hear this prazjaz, 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 and I just kind of wonder, it must be difficult.
Thank you for this question. So I'll say that I love what Angela said, calling this parallel poems. Yeah, it is very much a case of parallel writing, as much as the process of poetry writing is always a bit parallel, even in one language, I think. For me, poetry writing is not a kind of emotional outpouring onto the page, but a very intentional construction of meaning with the help of language. So it is a very slow process. It's very artificial, not in the negative connotation of that word, but in a very neutral connotation of this word, meaning that I am very aware that I write the way people do not speak, and I do not want to write the way people speak and use language. And I just happen to write in two languages that are acquired languages. All right, I, like many Belarusians, I grew up in a Russian-speaking family and considered myself Russian-speaking until a few embarrassing episodes in school where I was corrected and told that I'm speaking Trosyanka, yeah, which is a Belarusian pidgin, which combines Belarusian, Ukrainian, Polish, and Russian languages, and that's something that my grandmother spoke at home, and I spoke back and thought that I was speaking Russian the whole time. For me, Trosyanka and Pidgin is a kind of language of borderland, and it is not something to look down upon and to think of as something that somehow tarnishes literary Belarusian language. On the contrary, to me, Belarusian Pidgin is a testament to defiance of Belarusian language. It is a testament to resistance of Belarusian language and its speakers. It is a hybrid language, just like English, actually, right? English is very much a hybrid language, and there are so many Englishes, which is why well, one, of course, is a huge imperial language, and the other is very much the opposite of it, a small language with a long history of oppression. They share that in common, in that they're both hybrid languages. And so Belarusian, for me, is interesting precisely because of what it can say about impurity. And for me, impurity is always with a plus. Any kind of impurity. The further from anything nationalistic and fascistic, the better. And for me, the Belarusian ideal and Belarusian idea is the embracing of their multilingual, multi-religious, multinational space. And I think we already have a lot of missed opportunities in terms of how we could have been ahead of Europe in so many questions that relate to hybrid identities. All kinds of hybrid and marginal identities. I think that we could have been a country in which marginal is ordinary and normal and celebrated and embraced, in which hybrid is normal and ordinary and embraced. And I think that many of these opportunities are unfortunately lost because of various things, right? But so for me, what is so appealing in both of these languages, again, is that idea of their impurity and their history of mingling and hybridization. So when I think of English, I think, for example, of Caribbean poets. I think of African writers. I think of Canadian authors. Or Australian literature. So there are, of course, a great variety of Englishes inside this country. I remember here the very very influential and eye-opening for me were the writings of June Jordan on Black English and on insisting that children have a right to get an education and to not to be corrected in school for the language that is spoken inside their families. That children should not be shamed and corrected for their family speech and family language. And it was eye-opening to me in terms of my own Trasyanka experience in Belarus. So how I write into languages, I'm a very intentional slow writer. I go through many drafts. I dwell a lot. I'm somebody who dwells on one line, moving words around, substituting words. And that's a very good day for me. If I could focus on one line, I think that's a really successful day because I had time to dwell on it. So writing in two languages helps me dwell even longer. And it helps me think further into what I'm really saying. And in my experience, nothing is untranslatable if you approach a translation from the point of view of creative freedom, of translating intensity and intonation and tension. I could read a poem, for example, in two languages in which there is some of what David quoted in Antigone, a dispatch. There is a little bit of human irony and wordplay, and the translations are different in Belarusian. I mean, there are two translations. Every poem is a translation, right? Because every poem tries to translate a non-verbal emotion into language. It wants to translate a scream into language, the morning into language. Today we woke up to a great tragedy that happened in Atlanta, right? 8 people were shot dead, 6 of them women, Asian American women. I found myself completely speechless going through this whole day until 1 p.m. when I had to speak because Zarina invited me. But I could not open my mouth. I felt so heavy, such heaviness, such weight in my body. And the least thing I wanted to do is speak. Even something as simple as, I'm sad, I could not say, or this is tragic, I could not say. And so, and a poet always comes from that feeling of, I do not want to speak. This is where I think it always begins. Refusal to speak, that eventually is translated into a poem, which is also a refusal, of course, to speak the daily language, to speak in prose, to speak in normal sentences. Yeah, it is the, I find that I write and translate between the two and say, so, but what is it that I'm really saying? Is what I'm doing really interesting in the first place? Is it where sometimes the translation is a test, yeah, because sometimes it exposes the weakness of the line for me. So and then I think that in translation it doesn't quite ring well. And usually people say that because truly good poetry cannot be translated. But maybe I do not write truly good poetry because I have found that every time I cannot translate, it's because the line in one of the languages is not so good. And then the translation is often better because it's an extra attempt, because it's a harder attempt. So let me read Antigone for you in 2 languages. And those of you who are bilingual, you will know that little moment there with drag digging sisters pop-up burial. In English, it's a shop, like something and brothers, somebody and brothers. They usually cut meat or make hats, right? So these brothers, and in my poem is drag digging sisters, because it's a pop-up store. That's the irony of it. It's a pop-up shop for funerals, for burials, that unites women in this Antigone-style sisterhood of dragging, digging, and burying. But in Belarus, of course, that kind of history of those kind of shops is completely destroyed. It's just not there. We do not have the somebody and sons shops. And so in translation, it becomes a festival, Kapayan Kuplai, which means, right, which is also a little bit of alliteration. It means dig and buy, which is also ironic because it is also connected to the idea of, well, some kind of economy. It's economic, right? And then there is the Marathon Mama Myla Mертвых. Well, so everybody who grew up Russian speaking recognizes that little saying. And I forget that that line is translated differently in the two languages, because for me it's the same, because the irony of it is the same, the intonation of it is the same, the intensity of feeling in it is the same. And I spoke to my Swedish translator not long ago, and she also had a very good just a very good solution for it. I think that if you approach it with the idea of freeing language rather than taming it and capturing something, then it works. I'll read this poem in two languages and take more questions. Антигона, з мертвыми ясна, што да жывых вазьмі мяне ў сёстры. Я таксама высока цаню пахавальны бізнес. Фест капай купляй, марафон мама мала мёртвых. Кулачка, я раблю абход магіл нашай люксавай сямейнай маёмасці. На клавіатуры для катавання я трымала акорды, каб пальцы расцягнуць, як у вядзьмаркі. Я спаражніла нутро, як мяхі акардэона для лепшага гуку. Не сакрэцікі, а працу і пакаранне я раздзялю з табою. А плачам твайго брата я пакажу цэлыя лясы непахаваных трупаў. Мы прыбяром, як толькі дзве сястры маюць прыбраць у хаце. Касцям, што валяюцца, як шкарпэткі, бой попелу на дне каленных рэпак. Навошта спрачацца з мужчынам пра нямыты посуд, калі нам яшчэ чысціць гару чарапоў да бляску? Выхаваная статуямі, пастава я сука і кабыла, я цэмент у слязах. Мае магілы заўважыш здалёк, бездакорныя, як дзіцячая скура. Тут гісторыя падыходзіць да канца, як фільм тытрамі магілаў, як фільм безыменнымі тытрамі масавых пахаванняў, кожная яма, кожны пагорак пад падазрэннем. Вазьмі мяне ў сёстры, Антыгона. У гэтай падазронай краіне у мяне ёсць твару агністая рыдлёўка. Antigone, dead siblings are set. As for the living, pick me for a sister. I too love a proper funeral. Drag digging sisters, pop-up burial. Landlady, I make the rounds of graves, keeping up my family's top-notch properties. On a torture instrument called an accordion, I stretch my bones into fingers of a witch. My guts have been emptied like bellows for the best sound. Once we settle your brother, I'll show you forests of the unburied dead. We'll clean the way only two sisters can clean a house. No bones scattered like dirty socks, no ashes at the bottom of kneecaps. Why bicker with husbands about dishes when we've got mountains of skulls to shine? Labor and retribution will share, not girly secrets. Brought up by dolls and monuments, I have the bearings of a horse and a bitch. I'm cement in tears. You can spot my graves from afar, marble like newborn skin. Here, history comes to an end, like a movie with rolling credits of headstones, with nameless credits of mass graves. Every ditch, every hill is suspect. Pick me for a sister, Antigone. In this suspicious land, I have a bright shovel of a face.
First of all, I'm so happy to be here, and it's so amazing to hear you recite these poems. To hear you recite them in the original as well as in the translation is just really special. It makes me want to learn Belarusian. I was really struck by your comments about Tresianka. You know, the earlier question that I had was really about the conversation regarding history and family histories, and that question was really about the relationship between family history and official history. Zarina mentioned Khatin in her posing of that question, and Khatin is such an interesting case because it was originally erected in 1965, the monument, as a monument to these villagers who had been massacred by Nazis, was the official story. But it turns out that they were massacred by collaborationists, as was revealed at the end of the 1980s, which is to say by people from the region, not by Belarusians, actually by a Ukrainian battalion from Bukovina.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge complexity to official history in this area. There are, I think, histories that we will never know because the official history is so twisted out of shape or silent. We could say the same about the Holocaust in the East. It's the Holocaust of bullets, as they say, which is quite distinct from the Holocaust in Central and Western Europe, which was documented so fully by the Nazis themselves. So there's a specific quality, I think, to history in this region. It's unknowability, but also the overwhelming loomingness of the state with its versions. And I was wondering, in your access to history and your dealing with history, if you distinguish between the sense of state history and the sense of personal history. But then my question morphed as you were talking about languages and Pidgin. And this might be a separate question or it might be the same question, I'm not quite sure. And it's a question about the language of state versus the language of the family or the language of the country. And you know, it seems like you've been suspended between 3 languages. I always thought it was just 2, but you've got Tresianka there as well. As I said, I don't speak Belarusian. Do you ever, your poems are in Belarusian, they're not in Tresianka. Have you ever written in Tresianka? Or do you contaminate your Belarusian with Tresianka? But then the other question would be, can you use Tresianka to contaminate Russian poetry? Or did you as a child when you were told that you were speaking Tresianka? But then the follow-up question to that, which is what I was musing on while you were talking about Pidgin and about English and about translation, was about the distinctions between these 2 languages. English is also a hegemonic global language, like Russian. But it seems like your experience of it, at least, has been a place which is welcoming to the kinds of transformations which are possible for someone who is not a native speaker and who is doing things with the language which no native speaker would be able to. Yet there's a sense in which that's an enrichment of the language rather than a challenge to it or a deviation from it. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit as well about your sense of the politics and culture of language use in English versus Russian or Belarusian. So it's a complex set of questions, but I think they're all interrelated in some way.
I'll start by saying that in Russian, I think that in Russian literature and film, Belarusian and Ukrainian words are often used not as contamination, but as a mark of some kind of degradation and some kind of, something uneducated, uncultured. So these 2 languages are associated with something negative. And I don't think that there is a good understanding because I think Russian has such a long imperial history, there is very little understanding of how these languages can function without the hierarchy. And yes, then English, of course, also has that same tradition of swallowing and silencing. And I have American students in my translation courses who become very worried about translating into English and whether that's a violent act because of the nature of the English language and what it tends to do to these narratives that even though the intention might be to give voice and to give visibility, it ends up giving voice to itself, right? It ends up feeding on it and getting more powerful rather than really creating a space for the voice of the other. And so what I think about it, I think of English kind of just listening to you, I think like English offered me a cookie and I bit its fingers, right? So, and in fact, Paulina is here and I'm translating, almost done, we're almost done with her book. Which it was the first experience of translating from Russian for me. And it was not what I thought at all, because it made me confront the very idea, translated into English. It's coming out in the fall from Ugly Duckling Press. But it made me confront how much I'm not Russian and how much I'm not a Russian speaker, which is something that of course I always knew, but not quite until I had to work with a real Russian poet. And I had to look up the easiest, most ordinary words and revisit them. And because I thought that everything that I thought was Russian in my vocabulary was in fact Belarusian. And I had to check myself every time translating her. But what she does then to language, to the Russian language, is for me kind of similar to what Paul Celan does to German, all right, is it's great violence that is done to Russian in her work. And I saw it as an opportunity to do great violence to English. And I thought that I could do it so very well because as a Belarusian in the middle of them, in the middle between Russian and English, I was getting everybody that I want to bite, right? I was getting to bite them all. And so I think that the literature in English that is very interesting and that I read a lot is literature that, and poetry in particular, that is interested in doing violence to English, that works also with archives, with legal, for example, with legal language a lot. I'm thinking of somebody like Nurbesi Phillips, the Trinidadian poet, and her book Zong, and she tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks. I'm thinking of Selma Sharif and her book Look, and the way that it uses legal language too, because English language is the language of colonial law. English language is the language of ledgers that turned humans into numbers. That English language is the language that is really convenient to justify violence. It has all the means for justification of violence. And so I think that there is this whole new tradition of poets. I'm thinking also of Don Mi Choi, for example, who received the National Book Award for her poetry book this year. So there are all of these poets who are not for whom who are bilingual in different ways, and who are writing in English in order to not allow English to do what it wants to do and what it does so well, which is to conceal rather than reveal the history in which it has been used. So I feel that I come to it into that space that has been created by those poets. And it is already a very exciting and rich tradition. And in this way, I could say, well, because you stretched a cookie to me, I can do with a gesture whatever I want. Yeah, I do not have to take the cookie. I could do whatever I want with a hand too. And so remember that Paul Celan's definition of a poem as a handshake. All right, so that idea of that hand, of a stretched out hand here, and the way that English has used it with various people in its, in its colonies, in particular. I think it's very important here, what we do with that gesture as poets, how we shake that hand, what hand we shake, what hand we kiss, right? What hand we hold, what hand we high five, and what hand we bite and break its fingers a bit.
And I was wondering if Polina wants to add something to this.
Thank you. It's amazing and very difficult to listen to Valzhyna reading her poetry. I think it's very scary poetry. It's very striking and touching. But since we're talking about touch, right, and various encounters, it touches you in many ways. And this poem about Antigone, for example, who is simultaneously seems to be so much about not only the high Greek mythology and its modernist reading, but something also very pagan, very folklore, very fairy tale, macabre fairy tale. And this rereading of the myth is really unbelievable. And I think, and to listen to it in the original, in Belarusian, is also very touching, and in a strange way to, for example, to a foreign ear, being a Russian ear in this case, because you think that you recognize things, but then you immediately understand that maybe you don't. And it is, again, it's like this world of fairy tale where everything attracts you and deceives you. And I think this relationship between languages is precisely that, of total attraction and total illusion, and also constantly feeling that things are not what you think they are, what you want them to be. Right, and especially when we're talking about languages in these extremely complicated relationships. Like, for example, what happens in this poem about sisters, right? Because for centuries, the empire said, oh, you will be our siblings. We will have this cozy little thing. But we know that actually relationship between siblings can be the most uncozy ones if we dare to look at them closely. And this is what happens. In poetry making translation, you begin looking at things closely and you're like, wow, this is scary. And I think for me, experience of listening to Valzhyna, talking to Valzhyna, being translated, is all about, you know, this huge respect I learned from her to a word, attention, but also understanding, you know, that a word needs space, language needs space, that Belarusian language, for example, even in translation, just wants to say, you know, like, I need space. I don't want all this cuteness of let's all be brothers and sisters here. Let's redefine the whole familial relationship. And I think this process of redefining that is happening now between poets who write in Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, for example, because there are some great things are happening in these languages. And it's so interesting that sometimes we meet through English. This, of course, is very interesting. That this is, for us, among many, many faces of English, for us, this might be the quality of language. Like in English, we maybe can speak with less pain, curiously, at this moment. Because all this baggage, right, what Kevin was speaking about, for example, what Valzhyna said, English is the language that remembers lists of slaves on the ships. But each language carries that, right? You just said, Kevin, that, for example, in the awful things that were happening in the 20th century between Russians and Jews and Ukrainians and Belarusians and Poles, each of this language carries pain for each other. So sometimes when we use English, for us, pain might be a little bit mitigated, like with injection of painkiller, while in many other contexts, English hurts. And this is the conversation about contexts. And also, I absolutely believe that this is the conversation about not forgetting about all this simultaneously, right? Reminding each other, not pretending that we're all these cute cousins here.
Thank you, Polina. I always love it when you bring something to the table. It's always a different take and like opens your eyes immediately. Thank you. And I love the fairy tale aspect to it. There's so much to it, so much density and richness. Thank you. I know
it's
we also...
Valzhyna with her, Valzhyna, the image when there are bones like socks. You know, this is immediately kind of this domesticity of horror. This for me is one of Valzhyna's favorite things that she brings to us. Kind of amazing.
And I also hope that it's funny, you know, because we talk so much about pain and violence, but when, and I have to talk about it a lot with a new book, but I always want to say, and always forget to say during events, but wait, my work is so funny. Yeah, and Polina is here, and having translated her book just now, Selected Poems, I would say, we started talking about the cover for her book, and we were talking about those postcards from the siege of Leningrad. And at a certain point, I said, "But wait, it's such an erotic book. You know, why cannot we have something more vulvaistic on the cover?" Because it's such an erotic book, and also a very funny book too.
That sends us back to Polina's interview on Globus, where we actually talk about it. Polina talks about it, and Eugene Ostashevsky was there and discussed the humor in the siege poetry and also the eroticism in it, and that brings us to the same, you know, to the depths unthinkable. So I really recommend for the students, for the audience to go watch that as well. That brings another dimension to Valzhyna's poetry as well.
I
And
think
just
it's hugely important. On some level, it is almost impossible, unbearable to perceive certain things that we're writing about. It just, our system is not made to look at this. Our system shuts down, but laughter as a reaction, it allows us just to look at these things, basically, right? When they are not only horrific, but variously funny. And not only in terms of, I don't know, jokes, but even sounds in Valzhyna, to my ear, are funny, grotesque. And I listen to all this and I cringe and I smile simultaneously. Mm-hmm.
And perhaps because we're at the end of our event already, more or less, I think. I just want to say that there is so much humor during the ongoing Belarusian protests. How many jokes, really dark humor, how many ironies, how many funny stories that are shared. I remember reading not long ago, somebody receives a letter from prison from her friend, and she's in a taxi and she cannot stop laughing reading it, and the taxi driver says, "What are you reading? What is so funny?" And she says, "A letter from prison." And it's just this not dwelling only, not sentimentalizing, right? Humor allows not to sentimentalize, because it's always a bit directed at the self too, making fun of the self. Not taking it allows for pathos to run away. It's like a poison for pathos.
Thank you, Valzhyna. Maybe since we touched upon the protests, for those of our visitors and audience who is not exactly aware and up to date with what's going on, maybe you can say a few words more about the protest, your reaction to it.
No, I have not written anything about it in poetry. I have been writing essays, but I have not been writing poetry, precisely because everybody has been asking me for a poem about the ongoing violence. And so, and every time it renews my decision not to have such a poem. But I think that by now, if somebody doesn't know what's going on, probably nobody will help you. No, right? That's already an intentional, conscious decision not to know, not to know what's going on. There is, we have a country kidnapped by a madman and held hostage by a madman, and there is zero value to human life. Anybody can be arrested and is arrested anywhere, anytime. There is no legal system. There is a total collapse of a legal system. I think that yesterday I was reading that somebody advised defense lawyers not to get mingled in politics, yeah, as they defend political prisoners. So it's it's a great tragedy that is unfolding, but such tragedies are unfolding also in many places in the world. We know that. We know that this country has been in a crisis, and the protests in Hong Kong were going on before Belarus began. Ethiopia, Uganda, there have been these places of violence in around the world, and here we have in the middle of a European continent, a country, people kidnapped. This is how I feel, that people are held hostage by a mad dictator, And we see now, as we knew before, because the war in Ukraine is just across the border from us, that there is no, it seems to be that there is nothing that can be done by the international community. That there is no system, there is no organization that has some kind of a plan for situations like that can be immediately enacted so that people's lives can be saved, so that there could be some kind of action that is possible. And I think that, you know, I'm not a political analyst or anything like that to discuss this, but we discuss a lot the politicians and the political aspect of it, but maybe not enough the economy and the capitalist system and the way that business is conducted, and how it happens and how big money has to circulate, and Belarus is a part of the circulation. And so I think that yeah, it's tragic to see what's happening and to feel in fear and helpless and enraged.
I think it's very important that poets and writers and artists speak to the world about this, because I know, like you said, there are so many countries in which the unthinkable is happening, injustice is happening. So it's the way we see at Globus, we bring the awareness through literature, through poetry. So thank you for this passionate, I don't want to say speech, because we've been talking about silence, but for what you said, because I think it will really speak to people and lead them to seek more, to learn about Belarus and its history and its culture. And for those who are interested, we did have a program in which Belarusian poet Dmitry Strotsev read his poetry, and Valzhyna translated some of it, and few other great translators participated as well. So please look for that. This is very powerful poetry, and more about the protests. I know that we're running really short of time, and there I see questions coming from everywhere, and we didn't cover the music, and that you play accordion, and there's the whole layer of that in your book as well. But I think we'll have to do something else, or leave it for the next meeting. Thank you so much, everybody who was here. Thank you, Valzhyna, for taking your time, for your passion, for your talent, for your wisdom. Please do look for the books. We have them at Globus. We'll have the books in Belarusian at Globus as well. There are other places where you can buy them as well. And do subscribe to our channel. We'll have more poetry coming from all parts of the world, from all languages. And we don't do just English or just Russian or just Belarusian. We do a mix, and we try to bring all of it together. We see ourselves as a crossroads where everything comes together and has a voice.
Thank you so much, Zarina. Спасибо, дякую.
Дякую. Thank you.